Alright, hi everyone. My name is Jasmine, the artist behind Art by Jasmine Lillian. I have been an artist most of my life and an instructor in acrylic painting for a little over a year. Today we are going to learn how to paint this Galactic mountain scene over here. I have a list of supplies in the description below, so let's get started. Alright, so I'm using my coarse 1-inch wash brush. I'm kind of dabbing white on my palette and dabbing it onto my canvas, making the shape of the Milky Way galaxy. I dabbed in some of that yellow, mixing it with the white on my palette so it doesn't become too bright. Also shaping the galaxy. I pulled up a little bit of that magenta, mixing it with the yellow and the white to make sort of a coral color. Still kind of dabbing it on my canvas. Also doing some little swish movements to blend it. And I'm keeping my canvas wet by using a fine mist sprayer. I'm just blending that out there. So I cleaned my brush off really good. I'm pulling up some magenta and a little bit of white. Wanted to get all of that yellow off my brush, just to kind of put this on the edges. That way I don't mix my purple with my yellow. Don't want a brown galaxy, want bright colors. Just kind of adding this on the edges here and there. So I'm finally pulling in some of that purple, mixing it with my magenta, going on some of my borders there of the Milky Way. I want to make sure not to add too much purple. The purple will take over very quickly. I'm just kind of filling in the sides here and there, maybe adding some extra shapes. So I didn't clean my brush off this time. I'm just kind of using what I got on there, mixing in some of the Phthalo blue with the colors that I already had on my brush and maybe a little bit of white. Starting to make some shapes into the sky. Excuse my head, that won't be in the video later. So I am also starting to mix in like blues and purples and a little bit of my ultramarine blues, and I kind of go back and forth picking and choosing which ones I want to add in the sky just to fill the rest of the sky up with some blues. Blues, purpley blues. They're so close on the color wheel. It really doesn't matter which you use more of, just kind of go with the flow, finish out the rest of your sky with some nice deep colors. And there I kind of mixed in a little bit more of that like purplyish pink with a little bit of white, kind of adding some different variations into my sky so it's not all blue and the rest of it. Again, just finishing out the sky, dabbing and swishing my brush. My big head in the way. And I keep on going. Filling in all of the extra spots of the canvas. You don't want to have any canvas showing in the sky when you're all done with this. So I kind of go back and forth to add in my horizon line. That'll be what separates the sky from the water. So I grab my toothbrush, I'm mixing it with a watery white, and then I'm going to flick it back towards myself to flick some stars onto the canvas. And you can add as many or as little as you like. Alright, so I dried my canvas off. I am grabbing my coarse 1-inch wash brush again, going through and adding some pure white into the galaxy, and this time I'm going to be just dabbing. This is to add texture to the galaxy so it doesn't look completely smooth because galaxies are very rough looking. So again, just kind of using that white, kind of blending out, just dabbing my brush. I'm not brushing, just dabbing. There, and I'm mixing a little bit of yellow back in with my white, putting it into the brightest spots of my galaxy. And then I pulled in a little bit more of that magenta, just kind of reworking, getting my galaxy to the colors that I like it and where I want them to be. This is going to be your guys' galaxy, so you'll decide which spots you want to kind of edit during this second round. And I just mixed a little bit of my magenta and purples, and I cleaned my brush off really good before I did this. Anytime I switch from having yellows on my brush to adding purples, I clean my brush off. And I'm just adding a little bit more shapes into the side there. Again, this is still kind of a very purplyish pink color. My magenta and purple mixed together with a little bit of white. Just kind of working out where I want the rest of my galaxy to go into my sky. I like to work in layers. It kind of helps to give more depth to your galaxy. So all those stars that we sprayed on there, they're going to get pushed back into the distance with this layer, but we'll add more. So I'm adding some Ultramarine Blue to my brush. I cleaned my brush off really, really good. The Ultramarine Blue is a very transparent color, so I'm just kind of swishing it back and forth on my canvas. It doesn't completely cover up the stars that are behind, but it does make them look like they're further away. So I'm just adding this in some spots into the blue part of my sky, and maybe a little bit into some other parts of my galaxy if I want to blue them up a little bit. It's kind of just working out the kinks in the rest of my sky, making sure the rest of my canvas is covered. Don't want to have any spots of my canvas showing in the sky. Sometimes I make some little mistakes, like here I kind of added a little bit of that blue, and I will go back through later to cover it up a little bit or blend it out so it's not too dark. You see that there right now. I'm using a little bit of my white. I cleaned my brush off super duper good. All right, so I am spraying some more stars again with a toothbrush and a watery white mixture. The watery white mixture is basically you want to add enough water that you start to see bubbles when you swirl your brush around in there. So just flicking stars wherever I want to, all over my sky. I usually add a lot. All right, so I have cleaned and dried my brush off. I am going to work into the water reflection. I am using yellow and white mixed together, and I'm just gonna try to get a semblance of what the galaxy looks like in the sky. It doesn't have to be perfect, it is a reflection. So I mixed a little bit of that magenta with the yellowish white color, putting that on the sides. It's basically just reworking the colors that we already have in our galaxy. And I'm blending it. I'm gonna be super blending this. I don't want it to be textured at all. So I sprayed it with my fine mist sprayer. You can get one of those at Hobby Lobby again. I cleaned my brush off really, really good, mixing in magenta and purple to get that purplyish pink color back. Fuchsia, I guess, is what it would be called. All right, so I cleaned my brush off really, really good. I'm adding in some blues, using a little bit of the magenta and phthalo blue, mixing in a little bit of ultramarine blues in there as well, and using some of my purple, just like we did in the sky. I'm just making sure. And I always paint the sides and tops of my canvas as I'm working. That's not very fun to figure out at the very end, especially if you have a lot of colors going on in your painting. So just kind of finishing out my water. I'm using my fine mist sprayer to keep my acrylic wet. I am grabbing my mop brush now and just kind of lightly touching the canvas. It's like a whisper across your canvas. If you press too hard, you won't get the same effect, and this is just to soften my edges. I don't go everywhere, I just do a little bit here and there. When you pull your brush up, you shouldn't have too much paint, just on the ends of the bristles. And then I ended up grabbing my coarse brush to kind of go through and smooth it even more. And then I just used my brush to go back and forth on the horizon line to accentuate it. All right, so I am pulling in some ultramarine blue and some black with my square brush. It's the bigger square brush. And I'm making some mountain shapes. Very pointy and rugged mountains. It's very important when you're making your mountains to vary your sizes. So you see here I have that tall peak, and I'm just laying out where my mountains lay out, or the directions that they go. So with my brush strokes, I'm following wherever I want the mountains to lay. The angles are very important, so I'm kind of going to the right side on that top mountain peak, and then over here I'm just kind of brushing into that tall mountain peak. You can't really see it in the video, but when you're looking at your own painting, you can see where your brush strokes are going, and this is very important to lay out your mountains and the directions that they're going, because you want to follow these angles when you start to add highlights and shadows. And all I'm doing on my palette there is just keep remixing that black and a little bit of ultramarine blue, shaping out some other peaks that I want to have in my mountain. The more layers you have, the better your mountains are going to look. But you can create your own mountains. You don't have to create exactly the mountains that you see on my canvas up here. You just want to follow the directions the mountains flow with your brush strokes. So in between that tall mountain peak and the smaller mountain peak to the left is kind of a valley, so I was swishing my brush strokes up into that tall peak. All right. So I'm just mixing a little bit of white with my ultramarine blue. I cleaned my brush off really good, spraying it up to make sure my paint is nice and wet. And I'm using this light blue to add some mist to the bottom of my mountains. And I'm following the direction of my mountains. If you used your brush strokes, you could just follow those brush strokes up into it, using a little bit of my mop brush to kind of soften it out. And as I'm kind of working, you can see that I wanted to add even lighter mist onto the bottom, so I keep kind of adding a little bit more white, pulling that color up through. You see that there? I just added a little bit more of that white on that horizon line using my mop brush, trying to get a mist effect at the bottom of my mountains. And this is very important to keep your canvas wet. You don't want it to be too wet. You got to be very careful about using that mist sprayer. I use it at a very far distance so I don't have any drips occurring on my canvas. And I'm just using that mop brush to soften my edges. And when I use that flat brush, I'm following the lay of my mountains, the angles of my mountains, and pulling up and spraying again and softening again. So now I am using my palette knife, and I'm just using white, and just like Bob Ross does, I pull my brush across, just getting a little roll of paint onto my palette knife, and I'm following the directions of my mountains still, and I'm making sure to add my lightest areas where the light is touching. And fortunately for us, we built this galaxy that points right to where the brightest spots on our mountains are going to be. So as you see, I'm adding it onto the peaks that are closest to those light areas. And I'm making sure that I'm barely touching the canvas when I'm putting this paint on it with a palette knife. It's very important to know where your light is coming from, and it's also very important to keep following those angles of your mountains. Again, you can see just following the lay of the mountains. Maybe adding some little extra ridges and bumps there. I think kind of the bumpier you have your mountain ranges, it looks a little bit more detailed. Adds some interest to the mountains. So I'm mixing some of my ultramarine blue with some white now for my shadow color. And again, I'm just following the lay of the mountains and adding this into my shadowy areas. I'm not going to add it everywhere. I don't want to kill all of my dark that we added. And I'm creating another peak there, so if you ever just want to add some extra little peaks to your mountains, it's pretty simple. You kind of add another triangle in there and it creates a new layer. And these are your mountain ranges. You can add that little extra peak, or you could just keep it the way it is and have that really tall peak go in front there. And I cleaned my palette knife off a little bit. I added back some white so I can add some highlights onto that new peak that I just added. And then I grabbed my coarse 1-inch wash brush and I am like dabbing my brush on the bottom where the misty area is, just to make it even more misty. Alright, so I chopped in a little bit of foothills that kind of connect to the mountains. I'm using my larger square brush with some black mixed with some ultramarine blue to follow the lay of the land. Again, it's very important to know which direction your land goes. I'm pulling my land towards the right, and I'm holding my brush the skinny way to make sure to get some nice little spindly pieces of land that go into the water. And right here, I'm adding my second little hill. It's going in the opposite direction. It's very important to change up which direction your land goes. Creates a little bit more depth into your painting. And again, I'm kind of using my brush that skinny way to get some really pointy land that goes into the water. Just filling it in. Always paying attention to the way my land flows. And then here, I'm just kind of what I call fuzzing the edges, just adding some little tiny little pointy spots to make sure that my edge isn't just like a solid line. And just kind of editing there a little bit. So right now I'm using my 1-inch coarse brush. I'm mixing a lot of yellow, tiny bit of phthalo blue and a little bit of black. And I'm stamping some grassy areas into my hills in the background. Just stamping them in. Adding some light to the tops of those hills. Kind of continuing to do that. I cleaned my brush off a little bit in between there, that way I can get some more bright colors since our dark colors are still a little wet, and added a little bit more yellow to that. And stamping them in. I'm not adding it everywhere. I'm leaving some spots that are empty, adding little extra hills as I work along. Alright, so I'm using my little square brush now and I'm mixing some magenta, yellow, white, and a little bit of purple. And I am pulling my brush down, adding a semblance of what pine trees are. Just tiny little pine trees way back in the distance. Again, I'm just kind of pushing my brush down, adding some on top of my hills. Not everywhere, leaving some spots empty. I don't want to cover up all that work that we just did. And I thought they were a little dark, so I added a little bit more white to my color, and I'm just layering that on top of those there. And again, just kind of adding a little bit more over there in the distance. Of course, I know pine trees are not this color naturally, but I wanted to make my painting look a little bit more fantasy. Alright, so again, I'm mixing a little bit more of that magenta. I added a little bit of phthalo blue and a little bit of black to that same pile of the original tree mixture. I start my bigger trees now, and I start by adding the trunk at the top, and then of course trees, they're skinnier at the top and they get fatter at the bottom. I'm just dabbing that in there. And my brush is kind of like a teeter-totter. You'll be able to see it in the bigger tree there. I mixed a little bit of white with magenta to add some highlights onto the right side since the light is coming from the right. All right. And again, I'm just going through, I'm adding a little bit more highlights, brightening up those trees in the distance. And maybe adding a little bit more highlights onto those bigger trees. Okay, so I cleaned my brush off again. I'm dipping into that dark tree color that we just mixed, maybe adding a little bit more black to it as these trees are closer. As you can see, I am dabbing in these leaves as I work my way down the tree, kind of teeter-tottering my brush. Your hand is gonna be, it's like your hand is a tattoo gun. And I'm just adding some little friends for this tree there, adding one behind, adding one in front. And then I clean my brush off really good, and I am going back into that light magenta color, adding some highlights to the sides of my trees, and the highlights are going to be on the left side since the light is touching the left side of these trees. And on these trees, the one in the back there, I'm making sure not to go too far down so you can still see the main part of that tree that's in the front, and then the little tree was pushed to the front because I just went over it all with the highlights. Not completely, but you leave a little bit of black there. So I mixed a little bit more white with that highlight mixture, and I'm adding some sparklers onto the ends of my trees, making some spots pop a little bit more than others. I don't want to go too crazy with them, otherwise it'll lose its effect. Alright, so I am mixing a little bit of black with that yellow and still using this small square brush. And I'm pulling down. I'm going to my land masses and pulling down into the water to add some shadows. So again, I put my brush right on those edges of the land masses and pull down very, very lightly. I'm not pressing very hard here. And kind of getting the shape of the land in there. So I'm pulling down a little bit farther on these land masses that are closer. And I mixed a little bit more yellow with the black, kind of on the edges there, just to simulate where those grassy areas were. So I cleaned my brush off really, really good after I added that black. I'm adding white water lines into the painting, and they're mostly horizontal. It's okay to have a little wave to them, but you don't want too much, otherwise it's not going to look very realistic. And I'm also making sure to add some really bright spots right next to where the land and the water meet. It makes sense. Waves crash against the land. So of course it's going to be white there. And you want to make sure that you change up the sizes of your lines when you're adding water lines. Like in the far distance, you're going to have smaller ones, but you still don't have the same size line all the way across. I have some lines that are super long, some lines are a little shorter. And here I just mixed in a little bit of that ultramarine blue with my white, adding some darker water lines. And I'm making sure to put them right underneath my white water lines. It's a very stylized approach to some water, just getting some simple water in there. And I cleaned my brush off again, added some white, just adding some brighter water lines on top. Alrighty, so I have my big square brush again, and I'm mixing black with a little bit of ultramarine blue. I decided that I wanted to add something in that right corner, or that left corner over there. Just a little land mass. It can be any shape you want it to be, just like a little hill. And then I grabbed my 1-inch wash brush, the coarse one, mixing a little bit of yellow and some greens with that black to add some grassy areas. And I am dabbing in some grassy areas, and at some points I'll be pulling up at the top there just to kind of get some taller grass. And it may mix a little bit with your black paint, but that's okay. Once you kind of get some of those darker shapes, you can always go through and clean your brush off really, really good. Add back a little bit more yellow. See, like I did there. I have some tall grass, and I just kind of keep working with my grassy layers until I get something that I like. All right, so I decided I wanted to sketch, have a little subject into my painting, a little person sitting on a rock. And I used some chalk after I dried my canvas off really, really good. And I am using my round brush to fill in my shapes with some black paint. And you can really add whatever you want here. If you want to add another big tree, you can absolutely do that. Just something to give a little extra, maybe to add a story to your painting. I've done a few paintings where I add people into them. That's just a basic shape. It's nothing too drastic. I'm not trying to make it super realistic. It's a nighttime painting, so the figure is going to be very shadowy. And of course, my paintings have my own style to them as well. And I'm filling in the rock that I sketched out there too. Adding a little foot to show that they're sitting cross-legged. Well, not cross-legged, but they have their knees up on that rock. Just getting some extra shapes in there, maybe adding, I think I added a little backpack there. That's why I have a little extra bump sticking out. And then I'm going through and adding some hair to my figure eventually. I'm just kind of reworking my rock there, making sure that's full. And then again, now I'm going through the hair. Just adding a little bun on the top of the head and maybe some shorter hair. Not super long. And again, you can really put anything you want here. You can have a little tree, you could put a fire there. That would be a very interesting thing to add to this little landmass that we got going on here. And then finally, I grabbed my liner brush. I'm mixing some white with the tiniest amounts of pink and some yellow to go through and add some highlights. And I'm just making sure to go around almost like outlining my piece just to get some sort of highlights popping through there. Again, I'm paying attention to where my light is in my painting. And there we go, I'm outlining a little bit of a backpack that has like a triangular fold over it. Whatever you add in your foreground, just make sure that you add highlights to it. If you're doing a tree and you know your tree is to the left there, you're gonna add some highlights to the right side a little bit more than to the left side. And adding the straps to the backpack there. Getting a little bit of the shape of the hair. When I do details like this, I use my pinky and kind of use that to stabilize my hand on the canvas. You'll kind of see when I move a little bit that I get a little bit of black into my water, which you can always just correct that with your watercolors. Remember, we used white and like a light blue with the Ultramarine Blue and some white. Just adding some details a little bit more, get some more hair in there. In the way shadowy areas, I don't want to add too much. I just want to add some that you can see the shape of things. So it's also important to outline the shape of what is in your painting. Added like the shirt there, just so you can see it. So there you have it, our Galactic mountain scene tutorial. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave comments below. I would super appreciate a subscribe to my channel, especially if you want to see some more videos. Also, if you guys have anything that you want to learn how to paint, also mention that in the comments below. Happy painting!